I was the first Director of Public Prosecutions, or Chief Prosecutor of Hong Kong, to be appointed after the reunification in 1997. I knew exactly what was happening here, and I knew that the situation was being misrepresented around the world. I'm Grenville Cross. I'm an English barrister and a career prosecutor. Well, I was actually a prosecutor for the Customs and Excise Department in London in the late 1970s. And then one day an advertisement appeared in the London Times saying that the legal department wanted prosecutors in Hong Kong. So I discussed the situation with my father, and he said, "I'm sure you'll have a marvellous time and learn a lot, and it's only for 2.5 years, and you can come back after the 2.5 years." So after 2.5 years, I was still so much I wanted to do in Hong Kong. So I said to them, could I stay for another 2.5 years? And they thought about it long and hard. So, all right, you could stay for 5 years, but after that, you really will have to come back. so after 5 years, I'd fallen in love with Hong Kong. So here I am, still here, over 40 years later. Well, in those days, there were quite a few foreigners were employed by the Hong Kong government, and there was a small department in the Civil Service Bureau of the Hong Kong government which chose names for these foreigners who were brought to Hong Kong. And they chose Gong Lok Si for me, which was a very fortunate name, I understand, and means optimistic gentleman. Obviously, in 1997, after 1997, there were some changes. I mean, there were bound to be certain changes. In my own area of criminal justice and the law more generally, I suppose the changes were the Court of Final Appeal. The Court of Final Appeal was established, and that was a big change from before 1997, because they had to go, in those days, all the way to London to bring their final appeals. And of course, many people didn't have the money or the resources in order to do that. So that was one very important development, and a very healthy development. I always remember one in particular, that in the late 1990s, as you may recall, there was a crime spree in southern China, and it involved three main criminals. One was the so-called big spender, Zheng Qikeng, and another one was so-called Broken Tooth, Wang Kwok Koi, and the third figure was a man called Yip Kai Foon, known as the King of Thieves or Goosehead. And he was based in Guangdong province, but he used to come into Hong Kong in order to conduct his very daring crimes. And he was responsible with his gang for a whole spate of robberies in Queen's Road Central, of jewellers and banks. And he was actually caught when he was coming into Hong Kong for the last time by the police, and there was a serious shootout in Hong Kong Island. And he was severely wounded during that. But when his case came to the courts, I was ultimately responsible for it. But even at that stage, his influence was still great. When the case went to the Court of Final Appeal for the judges there to make their final decisions on the case, it was decided that it wasn't safe to hold the hearing in the Court of Final Appeal. And in order to have enough security, the judges from the Court of Final Appeal had to move to the Court of Appeal itself, which was in Queensway. And there were real fears, you know, that attempts might be made by members of his gang to enable him to escape. So that was quite a memorable incident. Well, of course, at the heart of one country, two systems is the idea that, as provided by the basic law, that the way of life will continue, and that the capitalist system will continue, and that the legal arrangements which existed before 1997 will continue. And all those things have in fact continued. So to that extent, obviously, it has been a success. There have certainly been difficulties, as we've seen. The protest movement and its armed wing in 2019 sought to derail one country, two systems. A plot was hatched thereafter to paralyse the Legislative Council and to provoke a confrontation with Beijing, but Beijing refused to be provoked. It signalled its commitment to maintaining one country, two systems, and through the national security law and the electoral reforms, the problems which have arisen have largely been resolved, and one country, two systems is back on course. Well, as I've explained, I've spent my career here, and in my own very small way, I've tried to contribute to the success of Hong Kong's legal system. I owe everything to Hong Kong, my family, my way of life, my career, my home. And so when problems arose in 2019, and I saw that a sustained attempt was being made by people in Hong Kong and supported by people elsewhere to undermine what we had achieved over many years, there was no way that I could just sit back and do nothing. I knew exactly what was happening here, and I knew that the situation was being misrepresented around the world. For example, over the extradition bill, this was an excellent proposal. What it was trying to do was to provide a mechanism whereby people who commit offences in other places and then come to Hong Kong can be sent back to 177 jurisdictions around the world with which Hong Kong had no extradition arrangements. And it appalled me, for example, the hypocrisy. The European Union countries objected to this proposal, and yet 10 of their own members had signed extradition treaties of their own with mainland China, and many of them had also sent criminal fugitives back to mainland China without any problems. And yet they objected to Hong Kong having a similar arrangement, even though Hong Kong is actually a part of China. So the utter hypocrisy of the whole thing appalled me. Obviously, we are facing difficulties. We've seen, for example, the suspension of extradition arrangements with various countries around the world, and that means that our criminal fugitives can escape justice by going to those various countries. Obviously, that's a big setback, and we hope that can be reversed at some point. Many children, sadly, have a very difficult time in Hong Kong today. There's quite a bit of child abuse going on. We know that every year hundreds of cases are reported to the Social Welfare Department, at least 1,000 a year. But this is estimated to be simply the tip of the iceberg, and many cases just never come to light. Now, I first became involved in the 1990s when there were a series of miscarriages of justice involving children. There were in those days very strict rules about children giving evidence in court, and these all favoured the defendant. When they got to court, they found the whole thing intimidating. So a number of cases were lost as a result of that type of situation. So I set up a committee, and I invited a lot of people to join my committee, a lot of experts. We produced a report, and the main parts of that report were firstly to make the rules of evidence far more flexible, to make it easier for children to testify, and then secondly, to allow children to give evidence by means of a live video link, so they could sit in a room by themselves. And the government, to its credit at that time, immediately adopted our report, and it was enacted within a year. So that was very satisfying. Well, I've always been fascinated with history, fascinated with the past. And at one stage, I almost became a historian. I wanted to study history at university, but I was persuaded that it'd be better career terms to switch to law and have history as a hobby. But I've always loved historical artifacts, antiques and so on, and loved the feeling of connecting with the past. Then I branched out into Shanghai postcards, so I have a lot of old Shanghai postcards for the 1920s, 30s and 40s. And whenever I travel, my first port of call is usually the nearest antique shop in whichever town I'm going to. So when I go to Beijing, it's either Liuli Chang, which has a number of interesting antique shops, or the Beijing Curio City itself. So it's a fascinating hobby.
Could you use 3 words to describe Hong Kong?
It's my home. That's all that needs to be said. It's my home.